In 2005, Kathy Benner and her husband came across a female bald eagle that had fallen near Juneau after a life-or-death battle in the sky. She was still alive, but badly injured, with severe wounds to her head and one broken wing. After several months of a remarkable recovery, Benner transported her more than 100 kilometers to Haines, where she was released back into the wild along with 4 other bald eagles. To distinguish her, they did not attach a tracking transmitter. She had only a small metal band around her leg. Before long, someone recognized her, and the panic was obvious on their face when they saw that same eagle plunge from the sky like a bullet. Thud! Her razor-sharp talons struck deep, tearing apart a fox that had been carrying food, killing it on the spot. The story quickly spread throughout the local area. An invasive fox species that humans had struggled for years to control was being taken down with ease by a bald eagle. But strangely, bald eagles had never seemed to regard foxes as prey before. What had caused them to change? And yet, compared with this shift in diet, what experts discovered afterward would repeatedly force people to rethink everything they thought they knew about this eagle. Red foxes first appeared in the United States in 1750. Less than 2 centuries later, from just 2 original individuals, they had spread to at least 86 islands in the Aleutians, while USFWS records show that foxes had been introduced to 455 islands across Alaska. Their populations exploded to the point where they could no longer be counted. But instead of seeing them as a dangerous, invasive species, people welcomed them enthusiastically because the profits from fox fur were simply too great. A single silver fox pelt once sold for as much as $2,800, an amount that would have taken an American worker at the time more than 2 years to earn. And Alaska was almost the perfect place to make money from them. All people had to do was lease an island, release the foxes, and let the ocean serve as a natural fence. The foxes found their own food and reproduced on their own. The farmers only had to return later to trap the animals with the finest coats. But years later, people finally realized that this seemingly effortless way of making money had created a series of ecological disasters. But the first people to recognize the problem were not scientists. Around 1811, the native Aleut people had already begun complaining that seabird colonies around the islands were becoming thinner after foxes appeared. Just 1 year later, in places such as Attu, the change had become too obvious to ignore. Cliffs that had once been filled with the sound of birds grew quieter, empty nests became more common, and ground-nesting birds disappeared the fastest. It would take many more decades before scientists began to. At the time, however, people in Alaska focused their attention and their anger on another predator, the bald eagle. Complaints kept growing as bald eagles appeared across these islands. Even though no one had actually seen an eagle eating a fox, that hostility led to the killing of at least 120,195 bald eagles. In 1936, biologist Olaus Muri traveled to the Aleutians to investigate the claims. He examined 28 nests and collected 399 prey samples, but found only one fox pup, about 0.3% of the total, and could not even determine whether it had been killed by an eagle or simply scavenged as a carcass. One fox family was even living just 183 meters from an eagle nest without being attacked. Foxes were clearly not a primary prey species. But soon, this story would be turned on its head. Alaska would eventually have to rely on bald eagles to help deal with the ecological disaster the foxes had caused. But before that, there was a more serious problem. People once believed that bald eagles competed with foxes for food. In reality, the opposite was true, and the foxes were far more destructive. They swept through seabird colonies that had almost no ability to defend themselves, digging into nests and eating eggs, chicks, and even adult birds. On Shyak, just 2 foxes among 156,000 seabirds were enough to disrupt an entire breeding season, causing thousands of nests to lose their eggs and chicks. From there, a chain of ecological disasters began. As seabird populations declined, the flow of nutrients from the ocean onto land was almost completely cut off. A 2005 study found that islands with foxes received 98% less guano, while fox-free islands had breeding seabird densities nearly 100 times higher. The soil gradually became depleted in phosphorus, grasslands weakened, and low shrubs began to replace them. Red foxes had altered the entire flow of nutrients from the ocean to the land. As time passed, fox fur prices collapsed, and many fox farms were abandoned. But the foxes remained and continued to reproduce. Removing them from the islands quickly became an urgent task. At first, people thought eliminating foxes would be just as simple as introducing them had been. They set traps, organized hunts, used dogs to track them, shot them, and encouraged hunters to harvest them. But as their numbers declined, the last remaining foxes became increasingly difficult to find. On Niski, foxes were believed to have been completely eliminated in 1969, but the following winter, they crossed a sandbar from Alade and recolonized the island. Yes, reducing their population by 90 or even 99% was still not enough. They could return and rebuild their numbers to what they had been before. But by 2010, something was capable of eliminating 100% of the red foxes, and it was not any human method but eagles. How did they do it? But first, let's return to one important detail we have overlooked. Remember that Murray had to travel by boat from island to island, climb up to eagle nests, and collect bones, fur, and fragments of prey left behind. He could only see what the eagles brought back to their nests. If an eagle swooped down, attacked a fox, stole the fish from its mouth, and then flew away, there would be almost no evidence left behind. Nearly 75 years after Murray, automatic cameras began to change that. In a project by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game at Gustavus Forelands, just around 10 cameras captured nearly 6,000 images, showing eagles, wolves, bears, and various scavengers constantly competing around the same food source. From 2010 onward, camera traps on Kiska, Amchitka, Umnak, and Unalaska began capturing scenes that surprised even experienced ecologists. These were no longer just a few tracks around a carcass or a few tufts of fur left behind. The cameras showed bald eagles actually swooping down extremely low, sometimes just a few meters above the ground, to steal prey directly from a fox's mouth. In one sequence, an eagle spreads its broad white wings and blocks a fox on a rocky beach, forcing it to stop for several seconds. At that moment, a powerful strike aimed at the back of the head or neck is enough to make the fox drop the piece of meat it is carrying. For fox pups, the situation is even more dangerous. Some footage shows eagles hooking their talons into the back or shoulders of a pup, lifting it into the air, and then dropping it from a height of about 20-30 meters. A tactic similar to what they have previously been recorded using on smaller prey on the Alaska Peninsula. From these recordings, 3 distinct attack strategies can be identified. The first is a neck hold. A bald eagle dives from a height of about 10-20 meters, locks onto the fox's neck or the back of its head, and pins it to the ground. An adult fox weighing around 6 to 7 kilograms is not always killed, but being restrained for even a few seconds is enough to make it lose control of the situation, panic, and often flee, leaving behind the fish, seabird, or piece of meat it had just taken. That is also why, in many pieces of footage, foxes can be seen standing only a few meters from a carcass, pacing back and forth and staring at it, but refusing to approach when 1 or 2 eagles are already waiting on a nearby rock. The second strategy is lifting and dropping. This tactic is particularly effective against young foxes weighing only about 1-2 kilograms. At that weight, a fall from 20-30 meters onto hard rock or gravel can easily cause broken bones, severe shock, or internal injuries. The footage is striking. A pup is pulled from the edge of the grass, suspended for a moment in the sea wind, and then dropped onto the gray, rocky slope below. Just seconds later, another eagle may land to inspect it or continue pecking. The third strategy involves several eagles working together. Although rarer, it is the most remarkable behaviorally. Some footage from Amchitka and Umnak shows 2 or 3 bald eagles surrounding a fox that is holding food. One lands in front to distract it, another flies low behind to force the fox to change direction, while a third cuts in from the side to snatch the fish or meat from its mouth. The eagles do not necessarily need to kill the fox. For them, stealing the food is already a victory. And it is this repeated pressure from food theft that matters most ecologically. If a fox continually loses its meals, it becomes thinner, has to spend more energy hunting all over again, and the pups waiting behind receive less food. Of course, an animal as cunning as a fox, one that can evade humans, would not be so easily hunted by eagles. Red foxes also adapted to defend themselves against bald eagles. Unlike most of the United States, many of the Aleutian Islands have almost no large trees. As a result, bald eagles often have to build their nests directly on the ground, on hillsides, rocky outcrops, or sea stacks close to shore. On Amchitka, bald eagle nests average only about 13 meters above sea level, and many are located almost directly on the tundra. That gave introduced foxes access to something they would almost never be able to reach on the mainland. Records of bald eagles in the Aleutians show that Arctic foxes preyed on eagle nestlings in ground-level nests on Amchitka before foxes were eradicated from the island. Researchers even found that eagle nest locations appeared to reflect this pressure. On fox-free islands, bald eagles could often place their nests in more accessible locations. But on islands with high fox densities, many nests were located on islets, sea stacks, or other difficult-to-reach terrain. In other words, if one side truly had to change the way it lived in response to the other predator, the available evidence suggests that eagles were actually under more obvious pressure from foxes. Modern cameras have made it even clearer just how dangerous foxes can be to ground-nesting birds. On Kodiak, between 2008 and 2016, researchers monitored 146 kittlets' murrelet nests. Only 33 successfully raised a chick to fledging, while 69 failed because of predation. In the 44 cases where cameras identified the predator, 41 were caused by red foxes. In 2016 alone, foxes destroyed 13 of 17 nests, the equivalent of 77%. Bald eagles, meanwhile, were among the predators most frequently seen around the study area, yet the cameras did not record them destroying any of these murrelet nests. And this is the part that changes the story. Foxes can be attacked by eagles in rare situations, especially during competition over food or when the foxes are still young. But foxes can also reach low eagle nests and take chicks, while at the same time devastating entire bird colonies that eagles and many other native predators depend on. These two predators are not simply hunter and prey. They have been pushed into the same food web, one that humans had already disrupted. But at this point, we also have to accept an important truth. Even though bald eagles can put pressure on foxes, they are not a complete solution to this crisis. Bald eagles themselves once experienced one of the most dramatic declines in American conservation history. In Alaska, they never disappeared completely, but between 1,917 and 1,953, at least 120,195 were killed for bounty payments. In the lower 48, the situation was even worse, as shooting, habitat loss, and especially DDT severely reduced their ability to reproduce. By 1963, only about 417 nesting pairs remained across the entire contiguous United States. After DDT was banned in 1972, along with nest protection, habitat restoration, and tighter controls on killing, bald eagles began a remarkable comeback. In 2007, they were removed from the threatened and endangered species list. USFWS data from 2018-2019 estimated that the lower 48 had about 316,700 bald eagles, including more than 71,000 breeding pairs. Alaska alone still supports a population of roughly 70,000. At this point, you may be wondering, if bald eagles have recovered so strongly, why don't they simply hunt all the foxes on these islands? The answer lies in the way bald eagles hunt. They are extremely adaptable predators, but they are not specialized fox hunters. Fish remain their most important food source, while they also take advantage of seabirds, waterfowl, carrion, and other small animals. A small fox pup may be attacked. A fox carrying a fish or feeding on a carcass may also have its food stolen by an eagle. But a healthy adult fox living on the ground, using dens and moving through vegetation, is not the kind of prey an eagle can hunt regularly. More importantly, foxes reproduce quickly enough to compensate for those occasional losses. On an island rich in eggs, chicks, and seabirds, even a few surviving foxes can keep the population going. So even if eagles kill some fox pups, that does not mean the fox population will decline enough to disappear. In the end, humans still had to do the hardest thing: return to the very islands where they had introduced foxes and eliminate each population one by one. But unlike the incomplete control campaigns of the past, the goal was no longer simply to reduce their numbers. If even a few foxes survived, the entire problem could begin again. One of the earliest campaigns took place on Amchitka. In 1956, refuge teams used about 11,000 strychnine pellets, along with 130 fish, seal, and bird carcasses treated with compound 1080. It was not enough. The following year, they deployed another roughly 85,000 strychnine pellets. Tens of thousands of baits were needed just to eliminate a population that humans themselves had deliberately created. After years of follow-up work, the campaign was finally considered successful around 1,960. But Kiska showed that overwhelming force did not necessarily mean victory. In 1964, about 50,000 compound 1,080 baits were dropped by aircraft across the island, which covers more than 32,000 hectares. Many foxes died, but not all of them. Some individuals survived, the follow-up campaign was never completed, and the population persisted. The lesson was clear. Killing 90 or even 99% of the foxes could still mean failure. On Agatu, humans had to pay the price for even longer. About 50,000 baits were deployed in 1964, and teams returned again in 1967 and 1968. By 1970, the island was declared fox-free. But 4 years later, when conservationists reintroduced Aleutian Canada geese, they discovered that foxes were still alive. From that point on, trapping, dogs, and other control tools permitted at the time were used to track down the final individuals. It was not until 1979, about 15 years after the first major campaign, that the last known fox was finally removed. By the 1980s, the approach had become more systematic. On Amukta in 1983, teams removed 49 Arctic foxes in just about 5 weeks. But they did not leave immediately. They continued checking for several more weeks, then returned in 1984, 1985, and 1,989 to search for tracks, dens, or any new signs of breeding. They found nothing. This was the difference between simply not catching any more foxes and actually proving that an island was fox-free. On Rat Island in 1984, the campaign was even more aggressive. Teams combined traps, snares, rifles, and other control tools authorized at the time, eventually removing 175 Arctic foxes from an island, covering only about 2,780 hectares. Follow-up surveys in 1985 and 1989 found no further signs of foxes. Big Koniuji, meanwhile, showed what the fight against red foxes looked like. From 1985 to 1986, over roughly 3 months of trapping, 84 red foxes were removed from the island. Bailey returned in 1987 and again in 1,990. No foxes remained. And then the sign they had been waiting for finally appeared. A new gull colony began forming in an area that foxes had previously been able to reach. Do you remember where that eagle was released? 17 years later, around May 2022, people near River Road in Juneau saw 2 bald eagles lock talons in midair, struggle violently, and then crash to the ground together. One survived. The other died. When rescuers examined the dead bird, they discovered a small metal band around its leg. Kathy Benner checked the identification number and immediately recognized it. This was the same female bald eagle that she and her husband had rescued back in 2005. During roughly the same period, Alaska was also gradually repairing the damage left behind by invasive species. The USFWS says that nearly 50 islands, covering a total of more than 1 million acres, have been restored through invasive species control programs. In some places, nesting bird populations have increased 5 to 10-fold, but rats and other non-native species still remain on some islands. And the biggest lesson is not that bald eagles are good and foxes are bad. Eagles simply hunt by instinct, and foxes are simply trying to survive. The problem began when humans introduced a predator into an ecosystem that had never evolved alongside it, and then had to spend generations repairing the damage. So when an invasive species has already disrupted an entire food web, should we wait for nature to restore the balance on its own, or should we intervene before it is too late?